But let's bring in our now conservative attorney, George Conway. George, remarkable that these people went to law school. But I want you to just talk just in general, and we're going to go through, again, just to show all the times Joe Biden's executive orders were either enjoined or overturned. But this happens, right? Presidents do executive orders at the beginning of the term. Not to this degree, not pushing the boundaries as much, perhaps, as President Trump has done. But this happens. There are challenges. Some things get through. Some things don't. But you don't have a vice president. I guess Spiro Agnew probably did. But you don't have a vice president going out there going, oh, the court can't do this. They can't stop our legitimate power when, of course, again, the Supreme Court determines what the executive branch's legitimate powers are and what they are not. And it has been that way for 240 years, has it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And, J.D. Vance is an embarrassment to the law school that I attended. But the fact of the matter is he's telling us something that we should have already known. And last week I said it. They are not going to obey court orders. They have decided that they are going to push the boundaries on executive power by basically infringing on the Article 1 power of Congress. And they are violating they're violating the Constitution, the text of the Constitution in the birthright citizenship issue. They are violating the text of statutes by having DOJ run around and do all the things that have been doing these executive orders. There's no reason that this government that has decided not to obey the laws and the Constitution of the United States is going to obey a court order. And as you know, Joe, having practiced law, there's really only one way that courts can enforce their orders when somebody is being contumacious and refusing to obey an order. And that's to send the U.S. Marshals out to take somebody in and to hold them in contempt or to otherwise enforce court orders. Well, who does the U.S. Marshals Service work for? The U.S. Marshals Service is part of the United States Department of Justice. It reports to Donald J. Trump. And what's going to happen here, mark my words, is that at some point, they are going to basically tell the United States Marshals Service, do not enforce any of these orders. We will not obey them, and you are not to enforce them. And once that happens, I hope it doesn't happen, but I know in my heart that it will. Our 236-year experiment in the federal rule of law, in democratic self-governance for the United States of America, in American constitutionalism, is essentially over.
Yeah. Let's just take a look to Joe's point here. President Biden signed 162 executive orders during his term in office, several of which were also blocked by federal judges. One of his first orders created a 100-day deportation ban, but that was suspended by a judge in Texas who claimed the order could cause the state imminent and irreparable harm. 6 months later, a federal judge in Louisiana granted a preliminary injunction against the Biden administration's suspension of new oil and gas leases on federal land. Biden's vaccine mandate for federal contractors was blocked by a U.S. district judge in Georgia. In 2022, a Louisiana judge stopped the Biden administration from lifting Title 42, a public health order aimed at stopping the spread of communicable diseases, but was used to expel migrants at the southern border. The judge ruled the order violated administrative law. 2 months later, President Biden was told he could not enforce his executive order protecting the LGBTQ community from discrimination in schools and the workplace. Then, in August of 2022, a Texas court ruled against the White House's requirement for hospitals to provide emergency abortions, regardless of a state's ban on the procedure. This past fall, a federal judge in Missouri temporarily blocked the White House's student debt forgiveness plan. Biden's executive order shielding undocumented immigrants who are married to U.S. citizens from deportation was struck down by a federal judge in Texas. And at the very end of last year, a judge ruled the Biden administration has to stop selling unused border wall materials. So Sam Stein, to Joe and George Conway's point, I mean, you know, the Biden administration accepted when the courts pushed back, but we're in a situation here where one can surmise very carefully that there may not be a similar situation.
Right. My favorite one of those actually took place in November of 2021 when a relatively obscure judge stopped the Biden administration's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. That judge was Aileen Cannon. She ended up being canonized, pardon the word, for her act, and she's now a judicial star in conservative ranks. So it does happen regularly. The Biden administration respected it. It was part of our systems of checks and balances. And J.D. Vance's tweet suggesting otherwise is plainly reckless. Now, I'm not going to go to the levels that George is, although I respect that where he says it. It's very well possible that they end up doing this. My mind is in this place where they are using this as sort of an effort to move the Overton window. And in fact, overnight, we did have some progress, I should say, in this case involving the Treasury Department and who has access to those payment systems, and they are in a negotiated settlement to try to figure out if they can figure out a more diplomatic solution to this than just disregarding the Republic, right? And hopefully that is the case. I mean, hopefully we end up in a place where we do this by the book. I do think George is right, though, to warn that we are dealing with a set of characters who, frankly, don't have that much respect for the book and are fine disregarding it if it suits their ends. So it's a scary time. And I think the other thing that we have to note is that it's just the blizzard, the dizzying, I think is the word that the Times used, amount of legal activity here, which does make it so that if you stop 90% of it in the courts, 10% does go through. And I think that's part of what the Trump administration is trying to do, is just throw everything they can. And if they get 10%, that's still a lot.
Yeah, to Sam's point, flooding the zone is a deliberate strategy here from the Trump administration. Their advisors, I wrote about this last week. They know not everything's going to get through, but if enough of it does, that will still be fundamental change. But I'm told there is growing frustration in the ranks of Trump world about some of these judges. Elon Musk has been tweeting all night about judges and suggesting that the Congress should impeach some of them. So that is something he is really seizing upon right now. George Conway, talk to us about how that process would work, if you can. But also, to your point, I'm told that there is some, it has not been embraced by the Oval Office yet, but there is some in Trump land who want to indeed have a test case, to defy a court order, to see what they can get away with, to dare the judiciary and the rest to try to stop them. And talk to us about how that would play out. What recourse could Democrats, the courts, the public have?
The only recourse is to go out on the streets and march. That is the only recourse. The courts have no mechanism to enforce their orders other than through the United States Marshal Service, and thus through the Department of Justice, thus through the executive branch. The reason why we obey court orders is because the executive branch complies with court orders. If the executive branch does not comply with court orders and makes a point of saying that we will not comply with court orders, the rule of law, as far as the federal government is concerned, is over. And that is something we need to start focusing on and discussing, because that's where these people will go. There is no logical stopping point for them. And this is, the only recourse will be for people to get out and say, we want the rule of law. We want a government that obeys the law. And that's going to require people to go out on the streets, because there is no other alternative.
George Conway, thank you so much for being with us. Jon Meacham, final thoughts. There have obviously been times throughout American history where presidents have been frustrated in matters great and small at the United States Supreme Court. Of course, Richard Nixon immediately followed the court's decision and turning over the tapes. One wonders, will the White House actually be so reckless as to throw away 240 years of constitutional republics, democracy, Madisonian democracy, over an executive order.
You know, the rule of law depends not simply on force, but on a spirit that you respect, that, in fact, you, the executive, are not the center of the world. And what President Nixon did when he faced an 8-0 decision that he knew at some level would end his presidency, the first thing he said was, "Is there any air in it?" I mean, what was there? You know, these are human beings. You know, was there any place to move? I think it was Alexander Haig who told him no, and that set in motion the final days. But it was because Richard Nixon had a sense of shame. He had a respect for the institutions. He had broken the law. He had smashed up some norms. But in the end, he followed it. Because when he lost George Wallace in Alabama, when the famous meeting of the senators comes down and Goldwater says, "Mr. President, I think you'll only have about 30 votes, and I'm not sure I'm one of them," he said, "Okay." And he left because he respected that institution. That's an amorphous, almost spiritual connection to the American experiment as we've understood it. Without that, no rule, there is no mechanism. This is about us. And the final thing I'd say, Joe, and you and I know a lot of these folks, is President Trump is president in many ways because of about 14 to 15% of folks who are Republicans before MAGA. Yeah. And they were the ones who, for a variety of reasons, decided that this was worth this risk. And it may just be that that's the 15%. That's the Chamber of Commerce folks, right? That's the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It may be Rupert Murdoch. That may be where this has to be adjudicated informally, but it may be where it has to be decided. And I don't think we're being hyperbolic here. I really don't. I think that it would be intellectually irresponsible and almost a dereliction of citizenship to sort of pretend that, oh, you know, Andrew Jackson did X, so we're going to be fine. I'm not saying that. This is an immense test of American citizenship.
Historian Jon Meacham, thank you very much for coming on this morning. We appreciate it.